ballroom was dressed in crystal light and quiet jazz, the kind of room where money didn't need to announce itself. It simply existed, in the cut of the jackets, the glint of the cufflinks, the practiced way people laughed, just a little too loudly at things that weren't funny. And then beneath the music and the murmur, a group of men in the far corner made a decision they thought was harmless. They pushed a single father toward a table where a young woman sat alone, her champagne glass gripped just a little too tightly. A few whispered words carried across the polished floor. 2 failures, perfect match. The woman heard it. So did the man. But only one of them was about to prove the room wrong. Ryan Walker was the kind of man who never entered a room looking for credit. He arrived at every space he occupied the same way, quietly, hands already ready to work, eyes scanning not for opportunity, but for whatever needed fixing. At 29, he carried the kind of stillness that most men his age hadn't earned yet. He stood 6'2", with broad shoulders built from years of physical work, and a face that was angular and clean without being harsh. His dark brown hair was cut short. He wore a charcoal dress shirt, pressed and simple, the kind a man irons himself because he has learned that small disciplines keep larger things from falling apart. He had been invited to the fundraiser gala, not as a donor or a guest of honor, but because the hotel where he worked as a maintenance manager had provided logistical support for the event. His supervisor had handed him a spare ticket and told him not to waste it. Ryan had almost left it on his desk. It wasn't that he didn't belong in a room like this. It was that he had stopped measuring belonging by zip codes and tax brackets 3 years ago, on the night his wife, Claire, did not come home from the hospital. Claire had been 31 years old. Strong, funny, stubbornly optimistic in a way that Ryan had teased her for and quietly relied on. She had gone in to deliver their second child, a girl they had already named. The delivery had been complicated. A cardiac event moved too fast and didn't pause long enough for second chances. The baby hadn't survived either. Ryan had driven home alone at 4 a.m. with an empty car seat in the back and a future that had been entirely rearranged while he wasn't looking. He had a daughter, Lily. 6 years old with blonde-brown curls that bounced when she ran and a laugh so full it embarrassed her when it happened in quiet places. She carried a soft cloth rabbit named Mr. Bunny every day, had carried it since she was old enough to hold things. Lily was why he got up in the mornings. Lily was why he ironed the shirt. Lily was why, 3 years later, he had chosen to stay in a life that sometimes felt like it had been built for someone else. The people at the hotel who knew Ryan, the housekeeping staff, the overnight security guards, the porters, knew him not because he was their supervisor, but because he remembered their names, asked about their kids, showed up early, and never once made someone feel small for asking a question twice. The guests barely noticed him. That was fine. He had one rule he had been repeating to Lily since she was old enough to understand it. When the whole room turns away from someone, he would tell her, "You be the last one still standing next to them." He had meant it as a lesson for her. He hadn't expected the night would come so soon when he would have to live it himself. He tucked the ticket into his jacket pocket that evening and kissed Lily on the forehead. She pressed Mr. Bunny into his hands for a moment, as if loaning him something for good luck, then took the rabbit back and told him he looked handsome. He smiled at that. He just didn't know yet that she was right. Madison Hart arrived at the gala precisely on time, which, in a room full of people who arrived deliberately late, was itself a quiet statement. She was 27 years old and the chief executive officer of the Hartwell Foundation, a nonprofit organization that had funded children's hospitals, domestic violence shelters, and college scholarships for more than a decade before Madison had taken the helm. Under her leadership, the foundation's annual reach had nearly doubled. None of that was what the room noticed. What the room noticed was the dress, champagne satin, V-neck, floor length, elegant without being excessive. and the way Madison wore it with the posture of someone who had decided very early that the world would be watching and had chosen to give it nothing to criticize. She was beautiful in the way that made certain people uncomfortable. Dark chestnut hair in a soft wave, high cheekbones, and dark eyes that were intelligent and, tonight, carefully composed. 3 months earlier, Madison Hart had been engaged to a man named Garrett Ellison, the son of a prominent Chicago attorney. The engagement had lasted 14 months. The wedding had been 8 weeks away, and then Garrett had ended it, not privately, not quietly, but in the way that some things end when one person doesn't particularly mind if the other is hurt. He had begun seeing the daughter of a state senator before the announcement, and the press had found the story before Madison had found the words to tell her own mother. The headlines had been merciless. CEO too cold to keep a man. The woman who has everything except someone to come home to. She had read each one and set her phone face down on the counter and gone to work. She had learned a long time ago that falling apart in public was a luxury she could not afford. But it had cost her something, those months of headlines and whispers, and the way people's eyes lingered just a second too long when she entered a room, looking for signs of damage. She had become, without her consent, a kind of public story, something people consumed from a distance, as though her heartbreak were a form of entertainment. She had not known anyone at her table that evening. That had been deliberate. She had chosen a seat at the edge of the room, away from the main cluster of donors, where she could fulfill her obligation as a sponsor and leave without being cornered into conversations that always circled back to the thing everyone actually wanted to ask. She lifted her champagne glass. She fixed her eyes on the stage at the far end of the room where a string quartet was moving through something slow and careful. She was fine. She told herself that. She had been telling herself that for 93 days. The group of men was clustered near the bar when one of them noticed Ryan standing alone by the far wall, nursing a glass of water, watching the room the way he always watched rooms, quietly, without judgment. His name was Douglas, a mid-level event coordinator who had worked tangentially with Ryan's hotel, and who had consumed enough bourbon to make the kind of decisions that look very different in the morning. He leaned toward the man beside him and said something that made the small group laugh. Put the maintenance guy next to the woman who got dumped on the front page. 2 disasters, 1 table. They were not subtle about it. 2 of them walked over and clapped Ryan on the shoulder with the false warmth of people who have decided you will be useful tonight without asking your permission. One of them said loudly enough to Carrie that the empty chair next to Madison Hart was practically calling his name. The laughter that followed was the particular kind that happens when a group is performing cruelty, just casually enough that no one feels personally responsible for it. Ryan heard it. He understood what it was. Across the room, at the edge table where she had tried to be invisible, Madison heard it too. She didn't move. She had learned to go very still when people made a performance out of her pain. She kept her posture straight. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the stem of her glass. Ryan looked toward the table. He looked at the woman sitting there alone, shoulders carefully square, expression carefully neutral, and he recognized something immediately. Not her face, not her name, not the scandal. He recognized the particular exhaustion of a person who has been made into a spectacle against their will. He had seen it in the mirror enough times to know it instantly in someone else. He excused himself from the group, not with irritation, not with any pointed remark. He simply stepped away, the way a man steps away from something he wants no part of. Quietly and completely. He walked across the room to the table. He pulled out the empty chair. He sat down. He looked at her the way he looked at every person who was clearly carrying something heavy, with the simple, unhurried attention of someone paying careful notice. "I'm sorry," he said. For the way they were behaving. That wasn't right. Madison turned toward him. She had expected a setup line. She had expected a man who wanted something. 3 months of unsolicited attention had trained her to anticipate the angle before the first sentence was finished. But there was no angle in Ryan Walker's expression. There was only a plain, unhurried sincerity that she had almost forgotten was possible. She said nothing for a moment. She just looked at him. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt like a person someone was actually speaking to. His name was Ryan, he told her. He managed maintenance for the hotel 2 blocks east. He had helped set up the systems for tonight's event and ended up with a spare ticket. He said this simply, without embarrassment, and she noticed that he didn't minimize himself or over-explain. He was a man entirely comfortable with exactly what he was. She told him her name was Madison. He nodded and said it was a pleasure to meet her, and then, remarkably, mercifully, he did not ask about the engagement, or the headlines, or what it was like to run a major foundation at 27. He asked if she'd had anything to eat. She blinked. She had to actually think about it. "I don't think I have," she said. He flagged down a server without making a production of it, and gestured toward the tray. He didn't make a comment. He just made sure there was food in front of her. It was such a small thing. It undid her more than she expected. They talked slowly, in the way 2 people talk when neither of them is performing. He told her about his daughter, 6 years old, hair like a lion's mane when she hadn't brushed it, obsessed with drawing tiny smiley faces on everything including his lunchbox. He said she always saved the last piece of whatever she was eating for someone else, and that he hadn't been able to figure out if he had taught her that or if she had arrived in the world already knowing it. Madison laughed at that. A real laugh, short and sudden, the kind that surprised her by happening before she could decide whether to allow it. She pressed her fingers briefly to her lips afterward, almost startled. She hadn't laughed like that in months. She hadn't realized she'd been keeping count. Ryan talked about his daughter the way men talk about the things they love most carefully, not with sentimentality, but with the precise attention of someone who has memorized every detail because those details matter. He said Lily had once, at 4 years old, given her winter coat to a classmate who had forgotten hers, and spent the rest of the day pretending not to be cold. She was shivering, he said, but she had this enormous grin on her face. "Proudest I've ever been of another human being." Madison found herself listening in a way she hadn't listened to anyone in a long time. At some point, without fanfare, Ryan reached across and traded her glass of still water for the fuller one in front of him. She hadn't asked. She hadn't even noticed hers was nearly empty. When a passing server struggled to navigate a tray through the tightly packed tables, Ryan half stood and moved his chair to clear the path. The server thanked him. He nodded and sat back down and continued the conversation without missing a beat, as though the gesture had been entirely unconscious. And she understood, watching him, that it had been. It was not performance. It was not strategy. It was the simple, unadorned behavior of a man who had been paying attention to the people around him for so long that consideration had become his default setting. Around them, the evening continued with its clinking glasses and its low murmurs about investment portfolios and real estate. A few people glanced toward their table, curious, some amused. Madison noticed none of it. She was watching Ryan Walker explain, with complete seriousness, the way his daughter had once tried to send a care package to the moon because she had decided someone up there might be lonely. And for the first time in 93 days, Madison's heart felt genuinely warm. The message arrived just after 9 o'clock. Ryan's phone lit up with a text from the babysitter, apologetic, brief. Lily had developed a low fever. She wasn't frightened, but she had asked for her dad 3 times. The babysitter had tried juice and a cool cloth, and the small portable fan Lily insisted made sounds like rain. None of it had worked. Lily had simply sat up on the couch with Mr. Bunny in her lap and said, very politely, that she needed Ryan. Ryan read the message and stood. "I'm sorry," he told Madison. "I need to go check on my daughter. Is she all right?" "Probably," he said. "But she's asking for me, so." There was no further explanation needed. Madison understood it immediately, not as an excuse, not as an exit, but as the uncomplicated truth of a man whose first obligation was the 6-year-old waiting for him at home. She said good night. She watched him leave, moving through the crowded room with the same unhurried purposefulness with which he'd entered it. The warmth she'd felt over the last hour cooled slightly. She picked up her glass. She reminded herself that evenings like this were transactions, not connections, and she had been foolish to forget that even briefly. She was rehearsing the opening line of her remarks in her head when she heard the small voice. "Daddy, is that the lady you were sitting with?" Ryan had returned. Not alone. Beside him, hand tucked in his, stood a small girl in a pale yellow sweater and leggings printed with tiny stars. Her brown blonde curls were slightly damp at the temples, and in the crook of her other arm, she carried a cloth rabbit, well loved, one ear slightly flattened, the fur along its chest worn to near smoothness from years of being held. When her dark eyes found Madison, they stayed. "She was outside," Ryan said quietly, a half apology in his voice. "The sitter drove her over when the fever broke. I was heading back in anyway." "I hope that's all right." "Of course," Madison said. And she meant it. She bent slightly so she was closer to the child's level. "Hi," she said. "I'm Madison." Lily studied her for a long, serious moment. "You look pretty," Lily said. Then, after a beat, but kind of sad, Ryan started to gently redirect her, the automatic parental correction of someone trying to soften the edges of a child's honesty. But Madison held up one hand softly. "It's okay," she said. Her voice had dropped half a register. "She's right." Lily looked at her father, who gave a small nod that confirmed something only the two of them fully understood. Then Lily walked forward 2 steps, reached up, and held out Mr. Bunny. "You can hold him," she said. "I always hold him when I'm sad. It helps." The ballroom, in that moment, seemed to exhale. The music continued. The conversations continued. But around their table, something had shifted so completely that several people nearby had gone entirely quiet, turning toward the small girl and the woman in the champagne dress without meaning to. Madison took the rabbit with both hands, gently, with the carefulness of someone receiving something that matters. For 3 seconds she simply held it, and then her composure, the composure she had maintained through 93 days of headlines and practiced calm, came apart quietly and completely. Her eyes filled, her jaw tightened. She pressed her lips together, and she cried. Not dramatically, not with the kind of tears that demand attention. She simply cried the way people cry when they have been holding it too long and something unexpectedly kind has finally given them permission. Lily climbed up into the chair beside her. She didn't say anything. She just sat there, small and steady, the way her father had sat down across the room an hour ago. 20 minutes later, the evening's master of ceremonies stepped to the podium. Before our keynote remarks, he said, "I'd like to take a moment to recognize this evening's primary benefactor. The Hartwell Foundation has contributed nearly $20 million to tonight's cause, resources that will go directly toward expanding pediatric health services across the metro region, funding emergency shelter programs, and establishing college pathways for young people in underserved communities." He paused. "Our deepest thanks to the Foundation's chief executive, who has led this work with extraordinary vision. Ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Madison Hart." The applause moved through the room in a wave. Around the table where Madison sat with Lily, tucked close against her side, Mr. Bunny still carefully held in both hands, a particular kind of silence gathered. The men who had laughed near the bar an hour ago found their expressions rearranging themselves. The women who had whispered looked at each other, and then at the floor. Madison stood. She smoothed the front of her dress. She looked down at Lily and whispered something that made the little girl nod. She set Mr. Bunny very carefully on the chair. She walked to the stage. And when she reached the microphone, she did not deliver the speech she had prepared. She stood there for a moment, a young woman in a champagne dress at the front of a very expensive room, and she looked out at the people who had spent the evening treating her like a headline. "This foundation has been my life's work," she said. Her voice was steady. "And I came here prepared to talk about the numbers, the programs, the projections, the expanded partnerships we're announcing. I'll get to all of that." She paused. "But first, I want to say something that isn't in my notes." The room was very still. Tonight in this room I was reminded of something I had almost let myself forget. Another pause. "I heard a lot of laughter this evening. Some of it was kind, and some of it," she didn't point, she didn't name, "was the other kind." She looked toward the table where Ryan sat with Lily. "The only person in this room who treated me like a human being, not a headline, not a cautionary tale, not a punchline, was a maintenance manager who came here on a spare ticket." Her voice did not waver. "He didn't know who I was. He didn't know what the foundation does. He noticed I was having a hard evening, and he sat down, and he was kind. A beat. And then his 6-year-old daughter gave me her stuffed rabbit." A sound moved through the room. Not quite laughter. Not quite tears. Something in between the two. $20 million, Madison said quietly. "And the thing that almost broke me tonight, and then almost healed me, cost nothing at all." She did not finish her remarks with anger. That was the part the room would remember longest. She had every justification to direct the evening's humiliation back at the people who had manufactured it. She had options. She used none of them for cruelty. Instead, she spoke about the foundation's work in clear, measured terms. She talked about the children's hospital wing completed the previous spring. She talked about the women's shelter in the South Corridor that now had enough beds for 40 more families than it had the year before. She talked about 63 young people who had gone to college last year because someone had decided to fund that door rather than close it. When she stepped off the stage and walked back through the applauding room, she did not stop at the table of the men who had laughed. She did not look at them with the triumphant expression they may have feared. She walked back to her table, sat down across from Ryan, and held out Mr. Bunny to Lily, who accepted the rabbit with the solemn care of a small person completing an important transaction. "Thank you," Madison said to Lily. "He helped." Lily patted the rabbit's head once, satisfied. Around the rest of the room, a quiet reckoning was taking place. No scenes were made. No confrontations occurred. But the room had been held, briefly, in the kind of mirror that only honesty and decency can produce, the kind that makes people see themselves clearly rather than comfortably. And some of them, in that uncomfortable reflection, recognized what they had done and felt the weight of it settle. Ryan was not watching any of them. He was watching Lily rearrange Mr. Bunny's position in the crook of her elbow, very seriously, as though the rabbit's comfort were the most pressing matter of the evening. He had not spoken during Madison's remarks. He had not raised his hand or directed attention toward himself in any way. He had simply sat at the table and let the evening be whatever it needed to be. That, more than anything else, was what made Madison Hart's hands tremble slightly when she reached for her water glass. 4 days later, Madison walked into the lobby of the Hartwell Continental at 11:30 in the morning. She was not there for an event. She carried a coffee in each hand and asked the woman at the front desk if Ryan Walker was available. He came down from the third-floor mechanical room in 5 minutes, still in his work clothes, a small smear of grease on the back of his right hand that he noticed and quietly rubbed on the hem of his shirt. He looked surprised to see her. "You didn't have to," he started. "I know," she said, and held out one of the coffees. They sat in the small alcove near the lobby's east wall, away from the foot traffic, and Madison told him the truth. She said she had come because the night at the gala had done something to her that she was still trying to fully understand, and she believed in addressing things she didn't understand directly, rather than waiting for them to resolve themselves. She told him that for the 3 months before that evening, she had begun to believe, quietly, The way a person believes things they don't want to say out loud, that every man who showed her attention was either curious about her money or curious about her damage. She said she had spent 93 days moving through rooms full of people while feeling more invisible than she had ever felt in her life. She said that the night Garrett had ended the engagement, she had not cried for 4 days, and that when she finally did, she had been in a parking garage at 11 at night because she hadn't trusted herself to do it anywhere she might be seen. Ryan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he told her about the weeks after Claire died. Not the dramatic weeks, not the funeral or the days when family had filled the apartment, and there was too much food and too many people saying the right things the wrong way. He told her about the quiet weeks that came after, when the apartment was empty again, and he was trying to remember how to do ordinary things. How to cook a meal. How to watch television. How to stand in front of the cereal aisle at the grocery store without stalling, because Claire had always picked the cereal and he had never needed to know which kind. He told her about the particular loneliness of being someone people felt sorry for, the way it changed how they looked at him. I stopped being a person for a while, he said. I was just a situation. Madison set down her coffee cup. Yes, she said quietly. That's exactly what it is. They sat in the lobby alcove for another 40 minutes. When she finally stood to leave, she paused at the edge of the alcove. I'd like to do this again, she said. If that's all right. Ryan looked at her for a moment. Yeah, he said. I'd like that too. The first story appeared on a Tuesday. A small item in a local entertainment column, speculative, vague, but pointed enough to make clear that someone had noticed Madison Hart leaving the Hartwell Continental twice in 1 week and had built a narrative around it. By Thursday, the item had been picked up by 3 more outlets. By Saturday, it had acquired the momentum that speculation acquires when people find a story confirming what they already want to believe. Billionaire CEOs rebound. Maintenance man or master plan. Madison Hart finds comfort in hotel staff. Trading down or starting over. Ryan saw the headlines on Saturday morning, standing in his kitchen in the pre-coffee quiet of 6 in the morning while Lily slept. He read each one carefully. He put his phone face down on the counter. He made coffee. He made Lily's lunch for Monday. He folded the laundry that had been sitting in the basket since Wednesday. And then he sat at the kitchen table and thought about what it would mean for Lily if this continued. He had been careful, for 3 years, about keeping the edges of his life clean, not out of self-protection, but out of something more fundamental. Lily had already lost her mother. She had already, at 3 years old, learned that the world could rearrange itself without warning and take the most important things with it. Ryan had organized everything since then around the single objective of making sure his daughter grew up in a life that felt steady and trustworthy and whole. He sent Madison a message that evening. Short, honest, and harder to write than anything he had produced in a long time. He said the attention was escalating and he was concerned about what it might mean for Lily. He said he wanted to be transparent with her rather than disappear, because she had been honest with him, and she deserved the same. Madison read the message in her apartment with the lights low. She understood every word of it. She also felt beneath the understanding, something she recognized as the same particular collapse she had felt in that parking garage, the sense of being a hazard in someone else's life. She did not respond that night. She sat with the feeling long enough to examine it honestly. And then, because she was a woman who had learned the expensive difference between facts and the stories she told herself about facts, she looked at what was actually true. The headlines were not Ryan's fault. The scrutiny was not his choice. And the concern he was expressing was not rejection. It was the concern of a man who took his responsibilities seriously, which was precisely the reason she had walked into that hotel lobby with 2 cups of coffee in the first place. She wrote back, I understand. Can we talk? 3 weeks later, the Hartwell Foundation hosted its annual winter benefit, a smaller, more intimate event than the gala, held in a restored civic hall on the north end of downtown. 200 guests. A program focused on the foundation's community partnerships. Madison had invited Ryan and Lily. Ryan had initially declined. He had said carefully that he didn't want his presence to become the story at an event meant to highlight Madison's work. Madison had said she understood. But Lily, whom Ryan had mentioned the invitation to more or less in passing, the way parents mention things they've already decided, to children who then have opinions, had asked 4 questions in quick succession. What kind of building? Would there be food? Could she bring Mr. Bunny? And why wouldn't they go? Ryan had not had a satisfying answer to the 4th question. They arrived a few minutes before 7. Lily wore a navy dress and her good shoes, and she carried Mr. Bunny with the calm authority of someone who had decided the rabbit's presence was non-negotiable. Ryan wore a dark jacket over a clean white shirt. The evening proceeded warmly. A choir of students from one of the Foundation's partner schools opened the event, and Lily sat forward in her seat during their performance with an expression of concentrated appreciation that made the woman seated next to her smile. But midway through the reception, a journalist working the room with a practiced air of casualness made his way over to Ryan. The questions started reasonably, and then sharpened quickly into the territory of the headlines. Is it true you and Madison Hart have been meeting privately? Is this a PR move on her part? Is the single dad angle something the Foundation is leaning into? The last question was designed to land badly. It did. Ryan felt the familiar pull, the internal compass swinging toward quiet, toward the path that asked the least of him publicly and protected Lily from exposure. He looked at the journalist. He looked at Lily, standing beside him with Mr. Bunny under her arm, watching with the calm, slightly solemn attention of a child who understands that something important is happening. And then he did something he had not planned to do. He walked to where the event coordinator was standing near the stage and asked, very quietly, if he might have the microphone for 2 minutes. Madison saw him walk to the stage. She went very still. Ryan stood at the podium without notes. He was not a practiced public speaker. He held the microphone slightly too far away at first, adjusted it, and then simply spoke. My name is Ryan Walker, he said. I work in hotel maintenance. I'm a single dad. And I'm here tonight because Madison Hart is one of the most genuinely good people I've met in the last 3 years. And I think it's worth saying that in a room where people know her work, but might not know that part. He paused. She funds children's hospitals. She funds shelters for women who have nowhere else to go. She funds scholarships for kids who lost their parents and still decided to keep going. His voice was even and unhurried. None of that makes the news. What makes the news is whether she was crying when she left a building. Another pause. My daughter asked me recently why adults like to laugh at people who are already hurting. He looked at Lily, then back at the room. I still don't have a good answer for that. The room was absolutely silent. I just know what I'd want someone to do if it were her. Madison walked to the edge of the stage. She stood beside Ryan for a moment, shoulder to shoulder, facing the room. She didn't take the microphone. She didn't need to. The look on her face said everything the speech had not. The gratitude, the relief, the particular composure of a person who has been standing alone for a long time and has just stopped needing to. Then Lily, from her seat in the 3rd row, climbed down from her chair. She walked up the 3 low steps to the stage, deliberately, unhurried, Mr. Bunny tucked in the crook of her arm, and she crossed the short distance to Madison and held the rabbit up. You can borrow him again, she said, if you need. Madison pressed her hand over her mouth. She breathed. She crouched down and pulled Lily into a hug, and Lily hugged her back with the whole body commitment that children bring to embraces. Both arms face turned into the shoulder, utterly present. The room, which had been still, became something softer. Not applause. Not yet. Just a shift in the quality of the silence, the kind that means something real has happened in front of people, and they have recognized it, and it has asked something of them too. In the months that followed, several things changed. The Hartwell Foundation launched a new initiative, a support program for single parents navigating financial instability and grief, and a separate resource network for women who had been publicly humiliated through media coverage of their private lives. The programs were practical, carefully designed, and built with input from the communities they served. Madison announced them without fanfare at a small press briefing on a Wednesday morning. Ryan became an informal community liaison for the foundation, a role that didn't have a title at first, and then did because the work needed one. He helped bridge the gap between the foundation's grant programs and the neighborhoods those programs were meant to reach. He was good at it the way he was good at everything, by paying attention, asking questions, and not leaving until the thing was working. Lily declared, sometime that winter, that Madison was the lady who borrowed Mr. Bunny, and that this mattered because only important people borrowed Mr. Bunny. Ryan did not correct her. There was an evening, several months later, when the three of them were in Ryan's small kitchen, the one with the crooked cabinet door he had been meaning to fix for 2 years, the one with the window that let in the orange light of Chicago evenings. Lily was at the table with her crayons, coloring something she had announced was a horse, but a friendly one. Madison was sitting across from her, chin in hand, asking questions about the horse with complete seriousness. Ryan was at the stove. The apartment smelled like garlic and something warm. There was no crystal light. There was no jazz quartet. There were no people watching. There was just the small, ordinary weight of a life that had found its shape. Ryan had once told his daughter, "When the whole room turns away from someone, you be the last one still standing next to them." He had meant it as something he was teaching her. He hadn't known, on the night he sat down next to a woman in a champagne dress at a table no one else wanted, that she would end up being the one who taught it back to him.